Sean Mitro, could you give me, I think I need to have some permission to record. I just want to begin that before we begin the session.
I've made you the co-host now.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're ready to begin now. So, hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to the launch of Widows of Colonial Bengal. We'd like to start off today's session with a welcome address by Dr. Prasoon Chatterjee. Could you take us away, sir?
I welcome all those who have joined us today for the book launch and discussion of Professor Aishika Chakrabarty's book, Widows in Colonial Bengal, Gender, Morality, and Cultural Representation. This is a book as much for academic discussion as for remembering the journey of women of South Asia from the time of the ban on sati to the act to enable widows to remarry, and going beyond the scope of this book to also remember the women who led the suffragette movement after a century of the abolition of sati. While this is outside the scope of the discussion today, one wonders how much changed and how much didn't during this century and after. On behalf of Primus Books, I feel honored to welcome such a distinguished panel of scholars and professors who have made a difference to this field of study. We are fortunate to have Professor Tanika Sarkar, Professor Rochona Majumdar, Professor Swapna Banerjee amidst us, and we will be joined by Professor Brian Hatcher later. We feel really privileged to have you with us with a prospect to listening to your views today. I welcome you all to this launch and book discussion. 4 years ago, the visionary who had given every resource and his guidance to build up Primus Books, Dr. Dhanesh Jain, had left us on this day, the 31st of March 2019. It is a well-known convention to remember the Sufis on the day they left this world. And while Dr. Jain was perhaps not a Sufi in the strict sense of the term, his devotion to academic publishing, from what I hear from our founder, Mr. B.N. Verma, and others, amidst the realities of the world of business, was as selfless as to attain such a form of tasawwuf. While we miss him, we hope that we are able to contribute to academic publishing and keep the vision alive. We begin today's book launch and discussion with the hope that his spirit will always guide us in our endeavors. I now pass on the baton for hosting today's session to editor Ms. Jyotika Mansata.
Thank you so much, sir. Before we move on to the main event, please do allow me to briefly touch upon the volume we're here to celebrate and to introduce our esteemed author and the panelists. Widows of Colonial Bengal presents issues that one may find relevant even today. Marriage and remarriage, the patriarchal obsession with a woman's sexuality, and the appropriation of women and related issues as larger cultural symbols. In 19th century Bengal, the so-called widow problem became a prevalent issue because of the sheer number of widows at the time, the effects of colonial rule, the rigidification of Hindu marriage, and the simultaneous attempt to desacralize the institution. Professor Chakrabarty's volume thus begins with the widely debated Widow Remarriage Act and goes on to examine the interplay among nationalist, colonial, reformist, and revivalist viewpoints on the so-called widow problem. Though much of this debate occurred without the input of the widows themselves, as seen in contemporary sources such as official documents and cultural nationalist writings, Professor Chakrabarty depicts the widows as more than one-dimensional, drawing from the memoirs and diaries of the widows themselves, as well as giving us glimpses into their acts of resistance. Now, the author of the volume is Professor Aishika Chakrabarty. She is professor and director of the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of gender history and feminist performance, spanning the social history of Hindu widows to the journey of female dancers from colonial to post-colonial Bengal. She has edited Ranjabati, A Dancer and Her World, and written several Bengali monographs, including Kolkata Nach, Shamakalin Nagor Nritya and Kolkatar Cabaret, Bangali Yunota Ebong Miss Shefali. Primus Books has previously had the pleasure of publishing her co-edited volume, The Moving Space, Women in Dance. Our first panelist this evening, Professor Tanika Sarkar, was professor and chair of modern history before she retired from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has edited and co-edited several volumes on caste, community, and gender in colonial India, such as Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, Community, Religion, and Cultural Nationalism. And she has also published several monographs on political nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. We at Primus have also had the pleasure of publishing her co-edited volume titled Christianity in Indian History, Issues of Culture, Power, and Knowledge. Our second panelist, Professor Rochona Majumdar, is professor in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. She has been a senior fellow at the American Institute for Indian Studies, a faculty fellow at the Frank Institute for the Humanities, and a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Emotions. With years of research on the history of Bengal, especially gender and sexuality, as well as modern intellectual history, we are eager to hear Professor Majumdar's insights on the subject of widowhood in colonial Bengal. She has also published extensively on these and other subjects, including volumes such as Marriage and Modernity, Family Values in Colonial Bengal, as well as Writing Post-Colonial History. Our next panelist this evening, Professor Swapna Banerjee, is Professor of History at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is currently a Distinguished Fellow at the Advanced Research Collective of the Graduate Center at CUNY. She was the Endowed Chair for Women and Gender Studies from 2016 to 2018 and is on the Board of Director of the Women's Founders Collective. She has worked on issues related to gender, class, race, and ethnicity, with a focus on servants, masculinity, domesticity, and family. Her recent works on these topics include Fathers in a Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India, as well as a co-edited volume, Mapping Women's History in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. Finally, our last panelist is Professor Brian A. Hatcher, who is Packard Professor of Theology in the Department of Religion at Tufts University. An expert in the area of modern Hinduism and colonial Bengal, Professor Hatcher's research explores issues of religious reform, vernacular modernity, and the colonial word of Sanskrit. He is also known for his writings on the life and work of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, one of which is Idioms of Improvement, Vidyasagar and Cultural Encounter in Bengal, which Primus Books is proud to have published. His annotated translation of the first book of Vidyasagar's Bahu Vivaha is due out soon under the title Against High Caste Polygamy, as part of the Religion in Translation series supported by the American Academy of Religion. After our panel discussion today, we will have time to take a few questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question for the author or for our esteemed panelists, please do leave your questions in the Q&A box below. And please let us know who your question is directed towards. Now, without further ado, I request Professor Aishika Chakrabarty to introduce and discuss her volume.
Thank you so much, Jyotika. Thank you, Proshun. And I'm waiting for this, and I was waiting for this moment for long, for this evening of book launch. I am honored and excited. I'm delighted to have on board the distinguished panelists like Professor Tanika Sarkar, Professor Swapna Banerjee, Professor Rochona Majumdar, Professor Brian Hatcher, who will be joining us shortly. Your presence, actual or virtual, means a lot. I am honored, I'm humbled. I thank Primus Books for making this journey possible. For me, it has been a long, long journey that finally touched its finishing line in 2022-23. And the process was not a very uncommon one for a historian or a student of history, because it's always kind of digging deep into the old brittle pages, dated facts, memoirs, diaries, novels, farces, pictures, because our archive is always scattered. Our archive is spread everywhere. And this book, Widows of Colonial Bengal, grew out of my doctoral dissertation, but it went into hibernation for long as I drifted to other shores of research and almost chose to retire from the 19th century women's question, which was my one-time obsession. And finally, it happened during the lockdown, and the lockdown made it happen. The closure of the outside world certainly hampered the research in a way, because libraries were closed and archives were inaccessible. But it made possible the journey inward, as I found some time to read, reflect, and revisit my old research, my old pages from the file. So at the very outset, I want to make two things clear. That the title of the book is a little wide and loose, because the book is primarily about the Hindu high caste widows, middle class, upper class widows of Bengal. And the theater of action is located within the geographic setting of Urban, the city of Calcutta. Though I had to move out in search of some other voices towards Badwan or Kasim Bajar sometimes, it is primarily about the city of Calcutta and its Hindu high caste widows. So not merely widows of colonial Bengal, because secondly, the colonial time is also opens up a vast canvas. But my calendar is, however, restricted. It's from 1850 to 1930, to be very precise, and dotted by some significant milestones, some significant events from 19th century Bengal. But I toyed with several titles, some general, some specific. I also thought and stuck for some time, like Wives of Dead Men, the pure, poor, and promiscuous widows of Bengal. But finally, the majority opinion voted for this title, Widows of Colonial Bengal, Gender, Morality, and Cultural Representations. Yes, 19th century Bengal, for any historian or student of history, is particularly fascinating. It's really intriguing. It's a decisive historical moment. It's a treasure trove of information. The time that produced, printed, and published a record number of discourses, petitions, pamphlets, polemics, and poetries, fictions, farces, memoirs, diaries penned by men and women, colonizers and colonized. And women's question was central to the diatribes, to the male worldview. And the first part of the social reform movement was synonymous with widow reform movement, as Uma Chakrabarty aptly termed it. This book has discussed how Hindu widows became the first theater of social experiments, seeking to accommodate new ideas within the existing social framework. Because if the first major social reform controversy was over the killing of widows, the next whether or not widows remarry, those who actually escaped the fire, escaped the flames, would be allowed to kind of channelize their sexuality through the legitimate mode of marriage. So in both these cases, elite reformers from the higher caste society invited the state to legally intervene in what they perceived to be gross injustice within the Indian social order. My book re-examines the discourses surrounding the much discussed colonial legislation and argues that the discovery of the widow problem in mid-19th century was imbricated in a heightening preoccupation with questions of their marriage, remarriage, sexuality, and survival. I tried to situate widows in their everyday, within the intimate and private domains, by leafing through their own words, by leafing through their memoirs, diaries, and also looked at their representations whenever they captured the imagination and anxiety in the public domain and became central to the male conscience or male moral anxiety about them. I have seen how issues of their purity and promiscuity, coercion and subversion, poverty, and their fights to win over fortunes and property rights gripped and engaged the media, the printed media there. So while the diagnosis of the widow problem is shared across the board, the remedies to redress the problem varied enormously during the two successive or overlapping stages of social reform and cultural revivalism. And I have detailed the process in my introduction and also in my chapters. I have shown in my book that how the reformist solution of remarriage was formulated, implemented, and then rejected by the majority, and how new solutions were sought and found during the era of cultural nationalism. Incidentally, the final draft of my book went to press during 2020-21, the time that witnessed a nationwide celebration of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's bicentennial birth year, when we hailed the heroism of the lonely Prometheus, the compassionate crusader, or the man who, with his indefatigable manliness, Aparajaya Pourush, as Tagore termed it, and eternal humanism, Akhay Manushyattva, represented the giant banyan tree that raised its head to the sky amidst the sick and stunted undergrowth of colonial Bengali society. Much has been written during this time about Dayar Sagar, about the man who swam across the Damodar River to meet his mother on a stormy monsoon night. But very little were written once again about his sexual anxiety about the widow. We chose to be oblivious of the fact that Vidyasagar also lashed out against Hindu religious and scriptural injunctions and asserted time and again that widows do not become purged of their carnal sexual desires and their bodies do not turn into stones with the death of their husbands. Stepping over this historical threshold of the birth anniversary of the lonely Prometheus, my book also comes as a humble effort to acknowledge his daring to come down and mire himself in the corporeal desires of the wives of dead men. In this book, my starting point is Widow Remarriage Act. And with your kind permission, if I'm not taking others' time, can I just talk about the chapterizations very briefly? Do I have the
Of course,
time?
ma'am. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So my starting point is Widow Remarriage Act, and of course the debate surrounding that, because the 1856 once again was hailed as a quintessential moment in Bengal's social history, a step towards an enlightened social order. But in a reverse swing, it also, the description of the Act, Act 15 of 1856 as a legal innovation, confirmed and reinforced that Hinduism forbade widow remarriage. The notion of a universal Hindu sanction against remarriage became axiomatic, since a widow, if remarried, ceased to be a widow. And this is the paradox of 19th century widow problem that my book has unfolded. I tried to unfold that paradox. And one aspect of that paradox also manifested in the way widowhood was simultaneously portrayed as normal as well as a problem. Widowhood was universally believed to render women socially dead but sexually alive, as Uma Chakrabarty termed it. A variety of moral and economic ills were associated with women who escaped the funeral pyres of their husband. And arguably, they lived as unsatiated and caused enormous social damage by their sexual misadventures. In Unconscious Absurdity, I have argued that widows remain symbols of unfulfillable womanhood. The book, the first chapter is about the Widow Remarriage Act once again, and because I have discussed how Vidyasagar's reform through text strategy, the term coined by Sumit Sarkar, raised several contentious issues regarding the Shastric validity of Hindu marriage, while his social argument turned on the issues of sexual morality and of widows. In the second chapter, I have argued that the concern of widowhood was in fact the flip side of the preoccupation with marriage and conjugal relationships. The crux of the widow problem is actually of the women who are significator of marriage removed, represented yet another facet of Hindu marriage. The widow problem, I argued, was inextricably and integrally related to contemporary debates on laws and rituals of marriage, and it should be located within the broader phenomenon of Colonialism and hypergamous marriage in Bengal. Chapter 3 is about the Brahmo reformist drive, because that is the only example of 19th century to desacralize Hindu marriage, because Brahmos also, the Brahmos were the heretic insiders of the Hindu society, and they bait for another legislation, not only to turn the sacrament into a contract, but they also tried to introduce widow remarriage to make intercaste marriage possible, to make divorce possible for women. So my chapter actually talked about the tussle between Devendranath and Keshav, and also the fight between, or the ideological conflict between Keshav and Shivnath Shastri. But I also talked about the choice and subjectivities of Shuniti Devi, about some untold tales of Bidhumukhi, Rukmini, Ganesh Sundari, the runaway brides and eloped widows. Chapter 4 is set within a very different space and time. It's in 1880s, and two momentous events shook the nation during this time. One, the social and legal drama triggered by Rukmabai, who actually refused to surrender to the non-consensual marriage with Dadaji. And Fulmoni's death, the age of consent debate, Fulmoni died out of rape within marriage. And the post-mortem report of Fulmoni became a major area of discourse of the colonized and colonizers. But in this atmosphere of reverberating anxieties about the tradition, culture, and female sexuality, this chapter is also about Behramji Malabari's crusade against enforced widowhood. I trace the journey of the pilgrim reformer, the term coined by Antonian at Barton, and how he desperately but unsuccessfully tried to bring widow remarriage once again under colonial legal scrutiny, 30 years after Vidyasagar's attempt. 19th century was drawing to a close, and my chapter 5 was about how widow problem was now there is no lasting solution, no single or simple solution, as Tanika Sarkar has often termed in her book, The Rebels and Wives. And so to redress the damage, nationalists offered Brahmacharya. The widow was enjoined to observe and embody deathless devotion to her deceased husband. The white marble statue of Hindu widow also symbolized the plight and virtue of the nation mother, which certainly came into conflict with flesh and blood reality. The last two chapters of this book was woven around two contrasting narratives. One, chapter 6, explored the idiom of loss, deprivation, penury, poverty. And the last chapter, chapter 6, I have picked up two mighty figures, Rani Rashmani of Janbajar and Rani Maharani Swarnamoyi of Kashim Bajar House. And I talked about their resilience and resistance and the legal battle, especially of Maharani Swarnamoyi. So with this, I kind of wrapped up my entire work. When I read this book today, I find out a number of slippages, omissions, many mistakes, and there is something that should not be done, or should be written this way or that way. I know there are a few problems in terminology, some editing. I need to kind of check it, and maybe I want to go back to the library once again to check some of the facts. But this book was made possible during the lockdown, as I said, and where some of the libraries and archives is closed. But once again, even bestsellers like Jatayu, Lal Mohan Ganguly, I think Bengali audience, Bengali readers are familiar with this name. He had also kind of Uter Pakostholi in his book, and he promised to kind of porer edition shudre nebo. So I do promise that in the next edition, I will also correct some of the slippages that I may have in this book. So over to you, Jyotika. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty. Now, before we begin our panel discussion, I request Professor Tanika Sarkar, Professor Rochona Majumdar, and Professor Swapna Banerjee to hold up the volume so that we can release the book.
May I also?
Of course, ma'am,
Yes.
please do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I now invite our first panelist this evening, Professor Tanika Sarkar, to discuss the volume and address viewers today. Ma'am, could you please unmute yourself? We can't hear you.
Thank you, Jyotika. And Aishika's done such a marvelous survey of her book chapter by chapter. There's little left for us to say, I think. But congratulations, Aishika, on your truly excellent book. And thanks also to Primus, whose publications are, as always, a work of art. Especially kind to my aged eyes. The print quality is very kind to my aged eyes. Aishika's study is of a special interest to me, given my own work on personal laws, colonial personal laws. And may I say that I was long back, I had managed to open up the National Archives collection of petitions on widow remarriage for readers. They were so voluminous that they couldn't be issued as one volume. So they broke it up, and so they did sew up the petitions into two separate volumes to make them readable. And they are an invaluable historical source into the feelings of those times. Aishika has made marvelous use of them, admirable use of them. Written crisply and with clarity, the book is a great pleasure to read. And above all else, like all others, no doubt, I was struck by Aishika's indefatigable explorations among so many diverse libraries and archival holdings. Some were truly a revelation. The Brahma Samaj Library, for example, which not many scholars have explored. And I certainly haven't, because whenever I went there, it was closed, and I don't very often go to Kolkata. May I also add that I was delighted to see the little-known autobiography by my great-grandfather-in-law being put to such good use by you, Aishika, and I refer to Guru Charan Mahalanabish's autobiography. I particularly liked, and Aishika has made the same point, the interplay among different sources, which taken together opened up a wide spectrum of questions and reflections on 19th century social processes. And her deft movement among official files, biographies, autobiographies, tracts, novels is striking. It makes the book a storehouse of stories, very different kinds of stories as told by Legislative Council debates, Indian petitions and counter-petitions, biographies of reformers, and above all, of widows, their own writings, accounts of marriages and failed marriages, of popular responses and protests against the act. What I missed a bit, though, was a relative lack of focus on lives, ideas, and institutions of the orthodoxy. And that would have explained more of what was at stake and what Vidyasagar had really to contend against. And here we must remember that part of the Brahmanical orthodoxy had agreed to side with Vidyasagar's proposed bill, only if he gave up the notion of remarriage of adult widows. Adult widows, even widows with children. And even though Vidyasagar in his discourses wrote mainly about child widows and their plight, he refused to accept that condition. And the final act, based on what his advice was, also allowed for widows with children to remarry without any constraints. And that is something we must not lose sight of when we read what he had to say for propaganda purposes, that unless we allow widow remarriage, widows are going to go morally astray. That was more a ruse, and he could have easily garnered much more support from the Brahmins had he gone along with the idea of virgin, of remarriage of virgin child widows. I also missed a little bit about the colonial social knowledge and policymaking processes during the critical mid-19th century debate, the critical mid-19th century decade. There is something, of course, about that, but the general political context and the constraints faced by the state and its intentions and so on, and how it engaged with various Indian actors, that would have added, I think, even more to your valuable study. The book is, as you said, wrongly named because it goes well beyond widow remarriage, though of course that does remain the main focus. And I'm very glad that you situate your discussion of widowhood against an elaborate context of Hindu marriage in general. May I ask you why you think marriage and widowhood in particular became such an overriding concern, such a dominant, almost obsessive issue for Hindus of those times? What were the purposes and implications of the preoccupation? And what elements in the general historical context led Hindus to focus on this? Because even though the law commissioners had first suggested widow remarriage, some of the law commissioners had first suggested remarriage to prevent female infanticide, to prevent infanticide and feticide. It was what Hindus were doing that drove the bill and the protests against the bill. Though very largely located in Bengal, Aishika has diligently introduced the works on Maharashtra, Punjab, and Uttar Pradesh widowhood as well, and this certainly enriches her Bengal perspective, especially because she points out the variations in widowhood practices. I thought maybe a bit more of census-based comparison with Bengal Muslim demographics would have helped further, because as 19th century Muslim reformers again and again pointed out, that though the Quran and the Hadith endorsed widow remarriage for Muslims, Hindu influence being so hegemonic, Muslims were not making their widows or allowing their widows to remarry. So how, what proportion and whether it followed the Hindu pattern would have added to that. And it's not true that you have only studied upper caste Hindu widows. You have certainly looked at lower caste figures as well. But there were also late 19th, early 20th century lower caste, quote unquote, lower caste manuals that warned against ongoing processes of Sanskritization that you discuss. Now, some sociologists have mentioned processes of reverse Sanskritization. That is, segments of educated, quote unquote, lower caste now shifted over to norms which were advocated by the reformist Savarna Bhadralok. Did you find anything like that in your research? You have been very thorough with the census data, a source that, for example, Amir Sen completely neglects. I wonder if you have seen Maruna Murmu's work, which too covers much of the same ground. You look closely at the growth in numbers of widows in certain years. Shouldn't you have correlated it with male mortality figures in those years to explain the fluctuations? Your chapter on ascetic widowhood offers a very comprehensive account of the discipline of widowhood. It ties it up with the nationalist re-imaging of celibate widowhood as a definitive sign of exemplary Hindu female chastity and capacity for self-sacrifice. You'll remember that Gandhi later called the widow the perfect satyagrahi. You could also have brought in how the sati figures in these discourses, because the sati was the original widow that Hindus and the state took up for reform and for opposition to reform. It was very interesting what you say about the widow being an embodiment of the nation itself in nationalist narratives. This involves, though, a surprising transfiguration of the widow from a state of permanent ritual pollution to one of exemplary purity. The citation from Akhay Chandra Sarkar about Dhumaboti was extremely interesting, and thank you for reading your sources so very closely. The mythological representation of Dhumaboti, however, describes her as a fearful and repulsive old hag. And you could have underlined a bit more what a strange and remarkable feat it was to turn this figure into the nation. I'm very, very glad that you look at significant. Am I running out of time? Can I take 2 more minutes?
You have time, please. Please don't continue.
I'm hurrying through. Keen to listen to the others. Very, very glad.
You don't need to hurry, please. Take your time, it's fine.
You look at significant fictional representations of widowhood and widowed desires, and that you discuss the classic works like Bankim and Rabindranath, as well as popular and pulp ones. Contemporary fiction is a most important window onto social ideas, and relatively few social historians turn to that. In fact, the way you have mined vernacular sources is really remarkable, and I'm very happy about that. Because once again, a lot of Western feminist scholars who write about these things completely naturally miss out on that. And your work will point out how significant these are. You have also used highly illuminating citations from 19th century protagonists and antagonists. Those from Vidyasagar and Dasarathi Roy are very important for capturing Hindu moods at both ends of the spectrum. But I thought that the citations remain a bit under-analyzed. In the case of fiction, it's important to probe the tonality, the nuances, the rhetorical strategies, the words that were used, to identify the subtext, the breaks in the structure of norms and values that they inflict. You have focused more on the plot summaries, and these two are extremely valuable, but the other aspects could have perhaps been brought in a bit more. And the last chapter tells a fascinating and captivating story about the exceptionally powerful widows to counterbalance rightly the narrative of victimhood, which pervades the rest of the book. As for the epilogue, I was reminded strongly of Pankaj Butalia's wonderful documentary on the widows of Vrindaban Moksh. I wonder if you've seen that. As I said, Aishika, you go much beyond widows, and the book is a large and crowded volume teeming with multiple themes. I found the organization somewhat intriguing, for you return to your chief concern after several extended lateral forays into other aspects of Hindu gender, and in the process, one occasionally loses the plot. Especially because the mutual relationships among different aspects of the gender system are not always made explicit. For instance, how does the Contagious Diseases Act resonate with marriage or widowhood? Or why do you go into a comprehensive discussion of civil marriage, since only a minor part of it relates to widowhood? And on which, moreover, as you have referred to this book, Parvez Modi's superb study already exists. Or why is the Rukmabai episode discussed in such detail, which again has been exhaustively dealt with by Sudhir Chandra, Padma Anagal, among others? In any case, since widows are your prime concern, would not Pandita Ramabai's work on upper caste Hindu widows be a more relevant reference point? The problem of marital rape too does not seem to fit in any obvious way, and I wish you had underline the logic that connect connects up all these different chapters and their sequence. Now, let me throw out a general question towards the end. Most of us assume that the widow remarriage law was a failure, and I have described it as a legal success, but as a social failure. It was a legal success, but a social failure. And in doing that, we compare the number of widows with the number of remarriages under the 1856 Act. I sometimes wonder whether it's the only way of gauging its impact, because perhaps many more widows were also married under the Civil Marriages Act. And Guru Charan Mahalla Nabish says how he was torn between the two acts and which one to marry under, and when he married a widow, and he eventually chose the Civil Marriage Act. Moreover, many widows would genuinely not have wanted to marry again for a variety of reasons. So just the slender number of widows who remarry, take advantage of these acts is perhaps not sufficient ground to write off the act's remit, especially given the fact that most early marriages happened among Brahmins, who were most resistant to the idea and from whom originated the idea of the prohibition on remarriage. We generally apply a rather mechanical calculus to reformist effects, the numbers of satis burnt or number of remarriages, etc. But the long-term and below-the-surface implications and importance of the reform, of what the reform questioned and disturbed, are perhaps incalculable. As for the introduction, I was very impressed by your historiographical discussion, which is chronologically arranged from the 1940s to now. And many of us, including myself, forget about the 1940s beginning of discussions of reform, and which in their turn threw up interesting reconfigurations of the debate on reforms. However, I have a small problem with your organization. Numerous scholarly opinions jostle together there rather uncomfortably and in a disjunct fashion sometimes. They do not talk to one another all the time. Nor do you connect the different historiographical stances with changes in the general intellectual climate or with debate among the authors that you are referring to, from nationalist liberal to liberal Marxist to Marxist feminist to post-colonial and so on. And that takes me to my very final grumble. Your own independent stance, above all, the ways in which your important work may continue or contest or add to the historiography is not sufficiently clearly articulated. Much of the time, with some reticence, you make your material speak for itself. And the material is certainly most impressive, and you have assembled it with great meticulousness. But I would have loved to hear your own voice just a little more. And you're too serious and mature a scholar, Aishika, not to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that discussion, Professor Sarkar. I now request Professor Rochona Majumdar to address the viewers today.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Aishika for thinking of me to be a discussant with this very august panel of speakers. But before I get into my remarks, I also want to thank Prasun, Jyotika, and Shanmoy for all the work that they've done to bring us up to this point. All too often on Zoom, we forget about the labors that actually enable us, to congregate in this manner. So thank you all. Aishika and I were actually conducting our doctoral research at the same time. So sometime in the very late 90s, early 2000s, I think that's when we first met at the National Library and National Library or Bongiya Sahitya Parishad, all of those places. And both of us were interested in rethinking or visiting once again the terrain of the really much worked terrain of gender relations and marriage in colonial Bengal. My own interest was in thinking about arranged marriage, and that resulted in my first book, Marriage and Modernity. And Aishika was working on, as she calls it in this book, the widow problem. Interestingly, both of us moved away from our original interests. I mean, I went into working on films, and Aishika began to work on the history of dance. And really, it was last year in 2022 that I came across this fantastic essay on the cabaret dancer Miss Shefali. And the way that problem was framed, that in the context of commercial theater, all too often you have these almost unrelated, I mean, one could even call them item numbers. You would have these item numbers of a cabaret, and they would be salacious, they would be titillating, and Aishika uses that as an entry point, and her case study actually is Miss Shefali and the kind of cultural prurience and masculinist discomfort that greeted her numbers. And really, when I take that essay together with this book, I see the widow as a prefiguration. I mean, not a one-on-one correspondence, that's not what I'm suggesting, but as a prefiguration of that figure of the cabaret dancer that continued to be vilified well into the mid-1970s, where she was seen as a figure of opposongoskriti. At the same time, there was in that figure, or in the figuration of the cabaret dancer, there was this tension between prurience and pleasure, between decorum and fun, between patriarchy and a pushback through female agency. And I almost feel like much more than me, I think that over the last 2 decades, your thinking actually has had a kind of, I mean, you've always returned to these themes of the questions of patriarchal control of women's bodies, the anxiety about women's sexuality, and you've actually revisited these themes across multiple sites from the colonial period into the post-colonial. And I see that as a connection between your most recent, or at least the most recent essay that I read on cabaret and the widow book. So with that, I mean, let me just say that I again, I begin my remarks with this essay because many of the same themes animate the monograph that we're here to discuss. And as I said, at least in my reading, this monograph offers a prehistory to many of these marginal figures, of which the cabaret dancer is one, in the 1960s and 1970s in post-colonial Bengal. And really, my point is to draw attention to the family resemblances between the upper caste Hindu widow as an object of desire, control, and anxiety, but also in a handful of cases that are documented in the book as an agent who mobilized her status as a single woman to stake claims in property. And I see a kind of long history that can be told from the widow onto the cabaret dancer. Aishika Chakrabarty, and I'm going to read out the few remarks that I've jotted down, because Aishika Chakrabarty has written an authoritative and a comprehensive history of what she calls the widow problem in colonial Bengal. But it is a big book. And just so that I stay within time, I think it'll be better if I read some of the points that really stood out for me. Alongside her own research into the subject, and I think Professor Tanika Sarkar mentioned this before me, Aishika also presents a critical compendium of the historiography of gender, family, and women in colonial Bengal. Now, I want to underscore this aspect of the book because as I read it, I was actually grateful that you presented us with what I'm calling a critical compendium, because I realize how deep and variegated this history is. Really, you begin with I think Shushabon Sarkar, and then you cover. There's a lot that you cover, but let me just mention some names that pop up: Shomen Nondi, Borunde, Shumitan Tanika Sarkar, Lucy Carroll, Mrinalini Sinha, Brian Hatcher, Shumanta Banerjee, Himani Banerjee, Omniya Sen, Partho Chatterjee, Rajat Kanta Rai, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Swapna Banerjee, and many others. The reason I appreciated it so much is because these days, when you say that you work on the history of the Hindu upper castes in 19th century Bengal, people roll their eyes. As I read through your generous accounts, and generous and meticulous accounts of historians who have shaped the field from Shushabon Sarkar onward, it is hard not to feel grateful for this body of work on which I think so many of us are basing our own researches off of. So I really I think that this is actually going to be an invaluable teaching tool for me, because you really give us, you give it to us in one place. It's a very good compendium. I mean, and for that, I'm thankful. I won't be able to go into all aspects of the book. As I said, it's a big book and it has a capacious structure. One yield of its capaciousness is that it allows us to see the history of social reform as a series of connections. So may I propose that one way of reading the book would be as a detailed gloss on what Shumit Sarkar, in his critique of colonial India, an invaluable series of essays, I think, in his critique of colonial India, captured in the enduring shorthand as the women's question. Following Aishika, we could characterize the women question as a series of struggles, some of which resulted in legislation, beginning with the ban on sati, continuing on to the widow remarriage bill, the various attempts to raise the age of consent, their repeated revisions and so forth, but also a pushback. So really, I mean, what you document in this, in the book, is a long history of sort of highs and lows, of crests and troughs. So the book's main focus, of course, is the 1856 law legitimizing the remarriage of widows. But because your focus is not just this one piece of legislation, but its antecedents and afterlives, as well as what I described as a movement which has its crests and low points, I see the widow remarriage bill here as a piece in a much longer history. So, and being of a piece in this much longer history. And Professor Sarkar has already mentioned some of the crests in the history of legislation. So the Rukmabai case about the restitution of conjugal rights in Bombay in 1884-86, the Pulmoni case, all of that, about which actually Professor Sarkar herself, among others, has written most eloquently about. I mean, hers was pioneering work. Your contribution is to try and see the figure of the widow as one of a piece with these other debates and ensuing laws. What threads them together is a sense of entitlement about women and anger when that entitlement is questioned. Alongside these accounts of male authority are detailed discussions of the ideal widow and her traits. And you have some nuanced discussions on the iconic widow in her white weeds. But this trope of self-sacrifice was tethered to create also the widow, the image of the widow as the nation mother, the Dhumoboti case, for example. So, and I think again that was mentioned. So, as a figure that's both abstemious and powerful, or really powerful because abstemious. And you have some very, again, I mean, these are names that any historian of Bengal comes across, but you've actually paused and dwelt on some of these. So Chandranath Boshu or Sarkar, all of these people pepper the pages of this book. Real life and fictional widows appear in later chapters of the book. If the widow was a fountainhead of chastity and brahmacharya, you ask, how then could she represent a threat? Some, like Chatmohan Bandyopadhyay, challenge the term enforced widowhood and argue that lifelong brahmacharya was the expression of the widow's peculiar notions of chastity and not in any way a result of social oppression. So there are many voices that actually crowd this field. As if to judge the merit of such assertions, Aishika turns to a chapter in which she discusses the widow's labor in the household. But there were some widows who also sought to work outside the home. And again, I think one of your strategies or one of your characteristics in this book is to tell stories, which I appreciated very much. And one such story was that of Sneholata Gupta, who was educated in the Loreto convent, married a lawyer, Kumudnath Sen. The marriage had her father's support, but not her mother's. And when the young husband died, the mother-in-law and her other son they connived to dispossess Sneholata. And I think this is a theme that keeps returning in the book. It's not just men against women, but women against women. In fact, the mother-in-law, and you give several success stories, and Sneholata is one. She goes on to teach in Darjeeling and eventually in Shantiniketan. And even if such stories are few and far between in mid-century Calcutta, because again, you give us some numbers like 12,000 sex workers, of whom 90% were widows, they were still there. These success stories were still there, and I think it's worth revisiting them. I recommend the chapters on widow autobiographies to all readers, but really want to close my remarks with the accounts of the two Ranis of Calcutta, Rani Rashmani and of the House of Janbajar, and the even more exciting account, in my opinion, of Maharani Swarnamoyi of the Kashim Bajar Raj. Both stories belong to the early to the mid-19th centuries and tell stories of grit and ruthlessness on the part of the widowed wives to hang on to their marital property, to fight with their mothers and sisters-in-law. So really, I mean, this book, I want to repeat the point that it's as much about pushing back against men as it is about, or to see women as a very vital part of patriarchy. That comes through in these stories very clearly. For me, this is the richest part of the book, as it shows, one, that a woman's world, by which I do not mean the inner quarters of the home, but a world ordered to some degree by women's own machinations. Here, both men and other women are the enemies. So these women were patrons, they were competitive, conniving, and they were able to parley their interests with contemporary elites and the British. Reading about these relationships also tells us that a reading of a women's only world as benign is a facile move. Men and women both wanted power. There are more instances of men getting it, fewer of women, but nevertheless, it's important to complicate the notion of power. So Rani Rashmoni, a Mahisho, ostensibly, as you point out, she's a supporter of widow reform because she hosted Vidyasagar's son's wedding in Rani Kuti. But you also offer contrary evidence. And I love that story where she gets together the opponents and proponents of widow reform, and then she serves food first to the people who oppose widow remarriage, and then asks the supporters of widow remarriage to eat off of the same plates. And then, it's such a grotesque thing to do, but where she says that, see, this is what a used woman is like. Just as you wouldn't eat off of the same plate that someone else has eaten from, why would you want to marry a woman who has already been married? And I found that to be a very, it was, for me, it was a moment that made me sit up. Swarnamoyi, again of the Tili caste, married at age 11 to a very abusive husband, Raja Krishnanath Rai. And you make very good use of Shomen Nondi's history of the Kashima Raj here. And, it really read like a film script. He kills himself with a double-barreled gun, but really, was it a suicide? Was it a murder? There's all of that. And then the Rani takes over the running of the estate. You document her quarrels with her mother-in-law, her sister-in-law. She's a patron of women's education, but ultimately when she sets up a college, it's in her husband's name. So there are these weird ties to a once abusive husband, right? I mean, and I think that, so the book really, as I said, it prefigures issues that continue to haunt the women's movement. Why would you continue to remember your once abusive husband? Not remember, celebrate, make sure that their name remains for all posterity. So there are all of these issues. So let me close this discussion with two questions. So, and one, I think Professor Sarkar has mentioned to some degree. So even though this, you say that this is a book about Hindu upper caste widows and social reform, there are moments in the book where you do talk about widowhood among other castes as well as Muslims. So, for example, there is also Kunjo Bihari Maiti, Phulmoni's father, and there are examples of Oriya Kaisthos mentioned in some part of the book. You talk about Bengali Muslims' support for the age of consent bill, but again, I mean, it's only if widow remarriage would be opposed. So my question really is what is the attitude of other castes to this problem? And I'm asking this because, again, recently I was reading Divya Cherian's new book, where it's a book about the 18th century, but nevertheless, I think she raises this very important question of, well, what was caste before colonialism and who counted as Hindu? And what she does is she says, she defines the history of 18th century India as a tussle between Hindus and untouchables, and actually folds in Muslims among the untouchables. Now, it's a very interesting and provocative way of thinking about Indian history. And I was curious, since this is the city of Kolkata, where there are many, many so-called lower castes who are also becoming mobile in class terms, I was curious about what their attitudes were to the whole question of social reform and widow remarriage in particular. Second, given the amount of archives that you've looked at, we've heard about, I mean, to some degree, the exploitation of widows, the story of self-abnegation, brahmacharya, abuse, these are well known. But again, I'm thinking back to Cherian's book. She has a very interesting chapter, for example, on abortions and how and under what circumstances in the 18th century abortions were frowned upon, which is not to say that extramarital affairs were not, but nevertheless, I mean, people there's a way in which Jains and Vaishnavas were anti-abortion, which made me wonder about, that aspect of the widows' lives, because I mean, we hear about illegitimate pregnancies. What happened there? I mean, were there children? How were they brought up? What kind of lives did they have? So in other words, what might a history of widowhood in those terms look like, where you think of the widow's progeny, illegitimate? What sorts of relationships might they have had with their patrons, and so on and so forth? And I know that you've already written a big book. You wouldn't have wanted to make it bigger. But if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. But let me conclude by offering my heartiest congratulations on such a wonderful work, which I'm sure will be read and used in classroom instruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Majumdar. Before we continue, I just wanted to quickly welcome Professor Brian Hatcher and thank him for joining us. We'll hear him speak shortly, but before that, I invite Professor Swapna Banerjee to say a few words.
Oh, thank you, everyone. And thank you, the team members of the Primus books, and especially Aishika, for drawing me into this panel. My comments is going to gloss over many of the praises and issues raised by my former panelists. I also thought I'll be the last one, so I did it kind of as a summing up piece, but nonetheless, I extend my heartiest congratulations to Aishika for producing such a fascinating, enriching volume for all of us, and not just for the Bengali readers, for the larger reading public. And as I recommended to my family members, and I wish my mother was an ardent feminist in her stances and who led a very long life as a single widowed parent raising 4 girls. So if she were alive, I would have presented this book to her. So let me turn into my comments. The figure of widows in the colonial landscape has a major demographic and cultural presence, and their precarious state thus call for state intervention, and therefore it signals their criticality and power, both in the colonial landscape and for the human psyche, for Bengali psyche of the period, and for us, who have seen their lives, witnessed their lives in one form or the other in our experiences of growing up. The much-awaited book, Widows of Colonial Bengal, Gender, Morality, and Cultural Representations, is significant for various reasons. Demographically, as the book shows, widows comprised more than 1/4 of women's population in Bengal, and towards the turn of the 19th century. The plight of widows, whether as satis or those who lived as unattached women, provided the impetus for the socio-cultural reforms and women's question in 19th century India. We know that, and since Professor Sarkar has fleshed them out in such beautiful details, I'm not going to go over too much into those intricate histories of legislations, of debates, of family consternations that rocked 19th century India over questions of widows. Widows were the single most demographic segment who straddled multiple domains. And the book is of special interest to me because it traverses domains that are close to my own work. First, widows double-dipped. Actually, they were the single most demographic segment who double-dipped as both children and women. Their location as subjects was tied, however, to their marital status. Through marriage, they were embroiled in questions of property rights and inheritance. This is something we also saw in Professor Majumdar's work earlier work on marriage and modernity, where she has dealt heavily with those questions. And of course, not to mention Professor Sarkar and Professor Hatcher, who have written extensively, Professor Hatcher being the expert on Vidyasagar, and Professor Sarkar have covered almost all the domains that this book has covered. So through marriage, widows were embroiled in questions of property rights and inheritance. The enormous literature surrounding widows revolved around caste, class, race, and morality. And these were predominantly the concerns that the Indian intelligentsia in the 19th century were trying to grapple with. Above all, the state of being of the widows, their pain, indigence, humiliation, and trauma constituted the deepest sufferings in human history. And Aishika has been able to capture all of those through her meticulous research that she presented in this volume. Further, the book digs into the past through a retrieval of social memory and government documentation by accessing the colonial archive, different forms of publications, and a variety of literary sources in Bengali and English. It is ironic that one of the most neglected and forcibly marginalized population in human history is so abundantly represented in past records. The presence and records thus compel scholars to restore widows in the pages of history. The author succeeds in doing that with significant deftness through 7 chapters and an epilogue, starting with Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and the Widow Remarriage Act, and ending with the resistance and resilience of the 2 Ranis of Calcutta. Professor Chakrabarty presents a rich social history of family relations and complicated family life in late colonial India. So family, which scholars argued as a succor and refuge for men, it was also a site of tremendous oppression for women. Their labor and care work, particularly of widows, constituted the colonial household, the mechanism of, they were instrumental in running the colonial household in many ways than one. So this is a much awaited book. This is a very important book that brings out all those different aspects of widows' lives into our attention. The book also demonstrates that despite attempts of reformers and ideologues to draw a supposed boundary between the public and the private, the colonial state intervened in matters related to the family and the domestic domain. As Professors Sarkar, Majumdar, and Hatcher have shown in their respective works, the most intimate and private matters, such as marriage and sexuality, were discussed and contested in the public domain, both by the rising intelligentsia and the colonial state. So the private and the public were deeply enmeshed. Family history and the history of one of its most hapless constituents was deeply entangled in the larger identitarian politics of the nationalist era. The book is commendable for shedding light on an important life stage of a woman's existence in colonial India. Widowhood represented a certain coming of age event in a girl's life. And, this is where I would actually like to have seen the author delving a little more on the question of coming of age on the life stage of a woman's/girl's life. But nonetheless, the book situates the widow problem by noting the changes from the reformist era of the early 19th century to the cultural revivalist period of the late colonial period. And I found that strikingly important because it is very important for historians who trace change over time to also note the changes of the social political landscape of the period, that the early 19th century efforts for widow remarriage was not the same when the Age of Consent Act was being was brought out and legislated and debated. So the widows were that, the book shows the widows were constituted through multiple and often contradictory discourses of the colonial state, of conservative and progressive reformers, and of women themselves. It is encouraging to see that, and again, I'm rehashing many of the points already the former panelists have mentioned. I'm particularly impressed to see that Aishika stepped beyond Bengal and Vidyasagar and widely referenced the crusades of Behramji Malabari to fight against infant marriage and enforced widowhood in Maharashtra. I especially enjoyed wherever she drew on the voices of widows, be it Nistarini Devi or Pandita Ramabai, Haimavati Sen, Rani Rashmani, or Rani Swarnamoyi Devi. The book is, I found the book totally engrossing as I leafed through the pages. I found chapter 5, Ascetic Widowhood, the Brahmacharya Solution, particularly instructive for its focus on Brahmacharya. And, Professor Hatchard is here, but let me say a few words. Brahmacharya has gained serious attention in recent historical literature, particularly in discussions on education and moral behavior, especially related to boys. Both the conservative institutions of cultural revivalism, such as the Gurukul Kangra in Punjab, and the progressive-minded humanists like Rabindranath Tagore, both invoked Brahmacharya for training of young boys. Brahmacharya was not a stage of life for girls in Indic texts that prescribed the Varnashrama Dharma or the 4 stages of life. Ironically, Brahmacharya was ordained for Hindu widows with a prescription of chaste, ascetic, restrained lifestyle that involved brutal punishment, denial, and deprivation of a woman's body and mind. So by attending to multiple facets of widowhood, from the pure and pathetic widows to enforced widowhood and state intervention, the chapter deftly identifies how widowhood was a reified construction. The figure of the widow was variously appropriated and simultaneously constructed by nationalists and ideologues, both for flawless purity and unruly passions. And I quote Aishika here. The book shows how the ideal of Brahmacharya was invented for widows and was fraught with contradictory representations. It alerts today's readers that anxiety, tension, and imagination played vital roles in creating the paradigmatic ideals for widows who were deemed chaste and pure and as sexually promiscuous and aggressive at the same time. Chapter 6, Survival and Maintenance of Widows, bridges the gap between the ascetic image of the Brahmanical widows with those of their lived experiences and precarious existence. The everyday life of widows was marked by rampant exploitation, sexual and economic, and their survival was marked by humiliation, insecurity, threats, and refusals. Examples from women's writings and experiences attest to their vulnerability in the face of a cruel, unjust, misogynistic social system. My absolute favorite is the last chapter, chapter 7, 2 Ranis of Calcutta, Resistance, Resilience, and the Fight for Rights. It engages with multiple sites of contestations and struggle in the colonial landscape. The debate on property rights and inheritance that involved the colonial state, the wretched condition of the 2 lower caste widows that involved abuse by their husband and family members, household politics, and especially women/widows fighting one another. While the life of Rani Rashmani is relatively better known, I will restrict myself to the story of Rani Swarnamoyi. It is of special interest to me as it touches on servants and their roles in hatching family conspiracies and trials. Swarnamoyi was courageous to fight the systematic biases against women and girl children within her own household, among her husband and in-laws, the larger society, and the colonial state. A 17-year-old widow, Swarnamoyi, with active support from Rabindranath Tagore and Vidyasagar, brought the laws working in her favor, and later became a major patron supporting Vidyasagar's crusade for remarriage of widows and Christian and Brahmo endeavors to support and rehabilitate widows and destitute women. It is really like a screenplay, as Rochona has described this chapter. She became a foremost donor for women's education and most educational institutions of the time. Bethune School, Calcutta Medical College, Berhampur College, and many others benefited from Swarnamoyi's grants. Notwithstanding the tribulations, both Rashmoni and Swarnamoyi were two iconic women who asserted their own right, resisted the multiple hierarchies and authorities that constrained them, and exerted their agency as powerful women and property owners. It is at this point that the book dovetails with the works of Ruchisha Narayan, whose several essays and the manuscript titled Agents of Capital, Widows, Family, Community, and the Law in Early Colonial India documents how widows became crucial mobilizers and managers of colonial capital. Rani Rashmoni and Rani Swarnamoyi were also joined by women from other parts of North India, especially of the Benares area, when propertied widows offered stiff resistance against growing masculinization of property laws by the colonial government. I hardly need emphasize that this work intersects with works on marriage and sexuality by Indrani Chatterjee, Maithili Srinivas, Ishita Pandey, Durba Mitro, Rochona Majumdar, among others. Closer discussion with the emerging scholarship would have added some zest to these stories. Despite its exhaustive oeuvre of bringing in so many literary genres and the secondary literature to readers' attention, I thought there was room for engagement with the current scholarship. There was a little bit room, for engagement with the current scholarship. I personally would have loved to see an independent chapter on efforts made by Bharat Mohamandal, Pandita Ramabai, and other women reformers to ameliorate the condition of widows. That information, however, are scattered throughout the text. So, and that's where, comes in a little bit of the organization and editing of the text, as Professor Sarkar has already pointed out. Also, in her zeal to unpack the rich and complicated narratives surrounding widows, the author, again, in my opinion, seems to lose her argumentative edge at times. The book delivers a lot more than its title, Widows of Colonial Bengal, conveys. It is a book about societal concerns with women's bodies and sexuality, of control, management, and distribution of economic resources and wealth. It is also a book of women's agency and assertion of rights. As the first book devoted to widows in Bengal, it lays bare through meticulous research the tangled and multi-stranded narrative that constituted the widows and the widow problem. It is a fascinating work to read as it brings to light the everyday struggles of an important yet neglected fragment of Indian society. Thank you, the Primus team, and thank you, Aishika, for delivering such an important work.
Thank you so much, Professor Banerjee. I now request our final panelist this evening, Professor Brian Hatcher, to address the viewers today.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all, and begin with also a word of thanks to the team at Primus for inviting me to join this session, to Aishika for writing such a wonderful, as Rochona put it, authoritative and comprehensive book, which I've really enjoyed going through and have yet to discover more in it, I'm sure. And to my distinguished panelists for joining me here in this session. I'm really honored to be included in the mix of such really accomplished scholars to whom I defer on many points of fact and interpretation. Like Swapna, I wasn't really planning to go in this order, so I wasn't planning to be the last one to speak, but I'll do that. And maybe it's fitting because I have less prepared remarks and just several pages of very exuberant notes that I've taken while reading the book, going back through it, diving in selected portions. So I thought what I'd do is identify 4 points that I thought I took away from this first engagement with the book, and then I can close with a few thoughts about possible areas for further exploration, whether by the author or by others maybe in attendance here today, or other scholars down the line who will engage with the book, because it really is a book that's full of a lot of material for people to discover in the primary sources and in the secondary literature, which Rochona emphasized the engagement with so much scholarship that's covered this period, but to do it with this lens on widowhood is really quite valuable. So the first thing I would identify, the first of 4 points, would be just the brilliant decision to focus on the centrality of the widow throughout this past, well, really 200 years since Ramohan's brief remarks regarding modern encroachments, right on up to the present day, but maybe a more narrow 100 years from 1856 up to 1956 with the Hindu Code Bill and all of that. So we have 100 years of attempting to address the visibility of the widow, but also her consistent denial of legal and economic rights. So there's a centrality of the widow throughout this period that we can talk about. The second theme I'll identify would be just the widow's role in the theme of new patriarchy, conjugality, and this patriarchal pressure towards brahmacharya. I think it's been discussed by others. I came in late to the session, so it may well have been discussed by others, not least Tanika, who has written so brilliantly on a lot of this rise of new patriarchy in the late 19th century. So I maybe won't have a lot new to contribute there, but I think the book does help us revisit that theme and add some texture and density to it. The third issue I would identify that I enjoyed, at least, was a dedicated chapter on the Brahmo Marriage Act of 1872, and calling attention to the context and the consequences flowing from that act, not least around marriage as sacrament versus marriage as contract. And the decision simply to raise up all the Brahmo actors who have been, even if demographically sort of not all that significant in terms of numbers, have been hugely important in terms of cultural impact. Then the fourth and obvious theme is this whole issue around widowhood and the economy of widowhood, the issue of inheritance rights, and these fascinating, if limited, number of stories of real profound resistance that many have remarked on already. I know the chapter on Rani Rashmani and Sharnamoyi, just brilliant chapter that I can come back to briefly, but a lot has been said there already. So just going back then quickly over these 4 points, I think it's amazing to dwell on the centrality of the widow, who's both so central to this so-called woman's question, as we've talked about, but is at the same time seemingly invisible on other levels, that the society simply can't engage the woman who's most profoundly present in all their lives. And I wanted to read a passage from the epilogue to the book because it takes up this question of why the widow was so central and why was it such an overwhelming concern. And if I could just read a few lines here from Aishika, because I think they indicate her style and the level of very readable engagement the book provides. She writes, "Why was widowhood of such overwhelming importance in Bengali society? Indeed, it seems to have remained an issue of enduring importance 2 centuries after the, quote, problem was discovered. The answer is simple. Enforcement of widowhood, that is social, if not legal, prohibition of remarriage, coupled with a long-held tradition of early marriage and hypergamy, produced large numbers of widows in Bengali society. They lived in every home as mothers, grandmothers, aunts, or daughters-in-law. A large number of women as widows continued to derive their identities as, quote, wives of dead men, but were excluded from active conjugality, legitimate sexual and reproductive roles. Widows remained difficult to reconcile within the social arrangements of Brahmanic patriarchy. And yet, widowhood was an experience in every woman's life, in reality or in the dread of expectation." And I think it's a very powerful passage, and I think the dread of expectation makes us think of Martha Chen's work, who Aishika refers to at one point, observing that by the age of 70, almost every woman is likely to become a widow during this period. And so this just overwhelming pervasiveness of the problem, the absolute visibility of the widow, and yet in some ways the way they were invisible to the male change makers who simply couldn't see their predicament, which to me is what makes Vidyasagar, of course, so compelling a case, because he tried in his admittedly limited ways to get his Bengali fellow citizens to see widows and to see the problems that they faced in real life. And I think that much of his work, as Aishika shows, is really framed with and centered around the predicament of wives and widows. And of course, Aishika reminds us how the pervasiveness of the widows in the fiction from the period. All the widows we know very well: Binodini, Kundanandini, Hira, Rohini, Kiranmoyi, Himalini, etc., etc., etc. I thought in particular of Indir Thakurun in Patar Panchali, such a compelling character, both in the novel and also in the filmic version by Satyajit Ray. Such a powerful and emotionally complex, and yet really clearly demarcating that limited life that was given to the widow. So thank you. And let's remember that the first chapter of Patar Panchali is called Balali Balai, right? It's a direct nod to the practice of Kulanism and the regulations around hypergamy and polygamy instated by Balala Sena, and about which Vidyasagar wrote with such force. So thank you, Aishika, for calling attention to all those women in their fictional roles and what they say to us about the real world predicament of women during this period. The second theme I mentioned was the new patriarchy, as we might call it, and this pressure towards widowhood and brahmacharya, chastity, and the widow becoming an icon of a kind of Indian spirituality that would be the redemption of the Indian people from the colonial project, etc. We know this narrative. I think many of us have engaged the compelling literature in this regard, again, with a big nod to Tanika Sarkar. But Aishika also helps us revisit it. And for me, it was very helpful to think in particular what's changing between, and Swapna mentioned this, the kind of attention to the changing historical context between even a Vidyasagar and a Bankim Chandra, let alone a Vidyasagar and a Ganapati Sarkar or something like that, writing in the 1920s, still actively opposing Vidova Vivaho, still actively arguing against that initiative. For Vidyasagar in his early colonial episteme and his moral framework, the glorifying the brahmacharya isn't really a part of the project. It's not important to him to celebrate celibate widowhood. He would rather, I think, allow widows to move back into the one realm that he believes they're given to experience the fullness of life, which is marriage. Now, again, his is a patriarchal view. It's limited, and we can say he couldn't foresee the possibility of full autonomy for women outside of marriage. But at least if you grant the fact that the one area in which women are allowed to fulfill themselves and experience bliss and joy, motherhood, right, companionship, all of that, the conjugal bed, all of that, he at least understood that was the one way society could give these women the fullness of experience. And so he sought to do that. Whereas Ganapati Sarkar in the 1920s, he says something like at one point, well, it seems so terrible to say there have to be so many widows, but when we think of them as the embodiment of Shatita and Seva, well, then we realize they're part of the Creator's plan. So he's capable now of just framing the widow in this kind of theological vision of a kind of new Indian modernity. That's a kind of Hindu-esque celebration of satiness and all of that. So it's a very different time that has developed by this point. Makes me think in some ways, ironically, Vidyasagar's vision of letting women be women in their conjugal roles is possibly more orthodox from a Shastric perspective than his later Hindutva kind of opponents, if you want to put it that way. He wanted them to have that fullness of married life. So this made me think about his Vidyasagar's celebrated doya, his pity or compassion. And in some sense, it was, I think, his appreciation of that embodied sentiment of love and affection that came in a family environment. And it seems as if his heart really was, in this kind of proverbial sense, broken by the suffering of widows that just was to him unbearable. So at one point, I think Ishwar Gupta, Aishika mentions, makes a snarky comment that maybe Vidyasagar understood better than anyone else the burning pangs of the widow lying in her bed all alone. And then, of course, for Gupta and Sarkar and others, it was the fear that these pangs of unfulfilled desire would lead to adultery and sexual liaisons outside accepted frameworks. But in some ways, he was right. Vidyasagar did appreciate the suffering and he wanted to alleviate it. So Aishika made me look at all that with a new set of eyes, and I really appreciate her attention to all the literature in that regard. Yeah, let me go on to the third point then, the Brahmo Marriage Act, context and consequences. I won't say too much more here. Again, it's a useful discussion of the difference between viewing marriage as a sacrament and marriage as a contract. And then, of course, the very loaded force of hanging on to marriage as a sacrament for those who would be the spokespersons for the Hindu revival and the representation of Hinduness in the face of colonial intervention. So the kind of fueling of the cultural nationalism that's going to rise in the late 19th century. But at the same time, we have this, what she calls at one point in a nice phrase, the long and powerful legacy, I'm quoting her, of Brahmo women in regard to pressing change in the social sphere. And when I've just completed a translation of Bahu Vibaho, which will be coming out, I hope, by this summer. And in conversations with Malavika Karlikar in Delhi, she and others had stressed to me, please be aware of how many Brahmo women were involved in advancing some of these concerns. So it really is important, I think, that where we can, we recover those names and those voices and that history, because otherwise we tend to defer again to the male reformers and think about their roles. So I was grateful there for the attention to that long and powerful legacy, as she put it. And of course, the tensions that, as she also reminds us, persist all the way down to Ambedkar in the 1950s, that this does not get resolved quickly and just persists and persists. The failure to face the challenge of widowhood in fullness with legal resolution. So then takes me to the fourth point. I'm mindful of time, which is the question of economics. And I was really grateful. At first glance, when I looked at the table of contents, my first suspicion was, oh dear, there's nothing in here on inheritance and legal property, issues of property and widows' denial thereof. And I realized, well, actually, it's in that final chapter 7 on the Ranis of Calcutta, and realized as I read that chapter how powerful that chapter works to show not just the predicament of the legal death of the widow after 1856, but also these remarkable figures of resistance and autonomy, their resourcefulness. This has been remarked on both by two other panelists, so I don't need to review all that necessarily. But Aishika reminds us there's no one, quoting an anonymous voice, there's no one in the world as poor as a widow. And again, thinking of Indir Thakurun in the film, you could see this image of poverty and ostracism and neglect. And yet the beauty of a human life at the same time. She's vestigial, and yet, as Aishika reminds us, vestigial, but also essential to the economy of production and consumption, accumulation within these new middle-class families. So again, omnipresent, invisible, but also absolutely essential. So this kind of tension just pervasive in the discussion of this material throughout these 100 years at least. And the power of this force, maybe we need more work on these widow homes that are also a powerful reminder of the predicament of what to do with widows. We'll ship them off to Braj or to Kashi and put them in homes and sort of put them out of mind. And as she reminds us, this wasn't just a 19th century phenomenon. This goes on to today, and then very powerfully reminds us of West Bengal and Uttar Pradesh battling over who should actually be responsible for all these widows and how should they be dealt with. So I really appreciated her attention to the economy here. And as others have pointed out, the section on the Rani Rashmani and Swarnamari just reads like wonderful narrative. I think Rochona mentioned almost like a film script. It really is. It really is engaging, and you just move along with it so easily. I really enjoyed reading that a lot. let's see, where does that leave me? I do think I would close, the one thing that's always struck me is on this inheritance history that Vidashagar, neither in Vidova Vivahu nor Bahu Vivahu, ever really takes up the question of what will happen to widows' property rights, what will happen with the passage of a law that would allow them to remarry. So he doesn't address it. He talks about sons and the obvious question of sons' status, the punarvu and all this kind of natural versus adopted sons and all of that. But what widows would face with respect to their ability to inherit, own, and alienate property, he just never addresses in either of those works. And it's a stunning kind of silence that I trouble over, and the book leaves me even more troubled as to why, for all his compassion, and as Aishika reminds us, he worked in close concert sometimes with figures like Rashomon or Charlemoy, then why couldn't he, using his platform, have said more about this? And was he himself just blind to the question of property for women? Was that just beyond the pall for him? So really, just an incredible book, comprehensive, as I've said, lovely written, beautifully written, and just a joy to read, dense with notes, which I enjoyed plowing around in the bibliography. So kudos on all those scores. So if I make 3 quick comments about what else we might do, it's really more in the sense of, wow, you've opened up all these possibilities. What else might we look for? 1872 emerges as this, or looms large as a date of some significance. You have the census, of course, you have the Brahmo Marriage Act, this is just the year after Vidashagar's published Bahu Vibahu, but it's also when Vidashagar establishes the Hindu Family Annuity Fund. And I was thinking maybe we need more work on this idea of creating funds and public resources to address the plight of widows. That may be the one place where he at least seems to come forward and suggest we need to have some structures in place to help destitute widows and orphans. So maybe we need more scholarship around the creation of annuity funds, the very idea of establishing these. The second theme that I thought might be interesting to explore more would just be explore some of those relationships. We have narratives about Vidashagar with which we're very familiar, but I would love to see another this sort of biography of Vidashagar that put him in close contact with these women that you mentioned, the Ranis of Kolkata, just to zero in on how he with them. What was the nature of their relationship? Can we recover any of that? There's so many, it's not that long ago, and yet, as many of you know here, it's difficult to get real firsthand evidence about what these relationships were like, but it's just fascinating to imagine what those were like. Maybe a fictional account, something like Shea Shamoy, would allow us to get at what would have been the nature of those relationships, what drove them, where were the tensions, et cetera, et cetera. And then third, I think Swapna kind of pointed in this direction when she spoke about coming of age rituals for widows and when women, but I'd love to have seen a little more on just the kind of ritual lives and religious performances of widows, how their lives were structured within the constraints that they faced, where their paths of devotion, membership in various sampradayas and performance of certain kinds of, even within the framework of brahmacharya, how did they find meaning within the constraints that were so evidently forced upon them? So I think something more about the kind of everyday lived ritual structure of these women's lives would be wonderful to have, to the degree that we can recover it in the periods that we'd like to go back to. So I went rather quickly, but I feel like I want to keep an eye on the time. And I just would close by thanking you again, Aishika, for a wonderful book, book I'll keep, and I'm sure I will use in my colonialism and religion in South Asia, as many others will. So thank you, and thanks to all the others.
Thank you so much, Professor Hatcher. As we move towards the end of today's program, Professor Chakrabarty, could I please request you to just briefly comment on today's discussion overall and sum up what we've heard today?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. I particularly like to thank each and every panelist for taking the pain to read my book. It's a really little big book. And I thank Professor Tanika Sarkar, because you once again triggered me to revisit my work and kind of write a paper once again why I have included the 2 chapters on Brahmo marriage and especially Rukmabai and Age of Consent, because while writing my thesis in the late 1990s, I many times thought of dropping these 2. But once again, I had to retain these 2 chapters because in 1887, Shobhabajar Rajbati had organized a special debating club and a essay competition, because I am not actually, or the Bengal literati and the intelligentsia were not actually looking at Rukmabai. I am at the same time the opponents of Rishwa Chandra Vidyasagar, who refused to accept their defeat even in the 1880s, they bounced back, and how the backlash is coming from Bengal, and how Akhoy Chandra Sarkar, Chandranath Bosu, Bireshwar Pandey, Shama Sundari Dashi, once again they defended the sacrament of marriage in Bibaher Boyashu Uddesho, and in Akhoy Chandra Sarkar and Ganapati Sarkar Vidyaratna, বিধবার বিবাহ হওয়া উচিত কিনা, এতদ বিষয়ক প্রস্তাব, এতদ বিষয়ক প্রবন্ধ. Once again, the question of widow remarriage resurfaced in 1880s, and Akhoy Chandra Sarkar talked at length about the absurdity of widow remarriage. Only after Rukmabai chose not to live with her husband, chose not to surrender to the non-consensual marriage. So, and I think we can go on with the
Professor Chakrabarty,
many asked regarding. I think many widows to prostitution. The center works in the entire work we wives, Kulin wives actually took to prostitution, and the first generation of caste were recruited from the rank of caste Hindu widows. So I think Contagious Diseases Act, definitely the time that I kind of dwelt in, and the debate that I chose to kind of handle while writing my work on widows talked about the deviance and the devotion and the conflict between the 2. Jyotika, I think we should take some questions from the audience, or because I like to thank Professor Hatcher because you and Professor Swapna Banerjee, Rochona, for all your comments, and I will definitely, if I have the time, or I'll try to answer why I have chosen to select the timing, the thing that is not actually within the rubric of widowhood. Because while Binoy Ghosh to Shumit Sarkar, all of them, while writing social history, and Binoy Ghosh's Vidyasagar Bangali Samaj talked about the network of Vidyasagar and how a section of the orthodoxy, a section of the powerful elite of Bengal, and also the colonial elite and also the white masters actually facilitated the passing of the Widow Remarriage Act. So I think this entire setting of Vidyasagar had been nicely discussed in the works of Shumit Sarkar and also by Binoy Ghosh that Tanika has just mentioned. And I do believe that I have written a lot on the historiography. There's so many historians, starting from Jadunath Sarkar to Shushrughn Sarkar, and then Brian Hatcher, once again kind of woven together multiple strands of historians who talked about the many paradigms. Hatcher called it paradigm, revolutionary paradigm, the post-revolutionary paradigm, and then the subaltern and the feminist, all of them, and widows remain central to the entire historiographic trajectory. So yes, I have missed out many names because I want to share one anecdote here that in 2001, one of my essays from my PhD thesis, The Constant as the Pollster, debates on Hindu marriage in 19th century Bengal, won the best paper award in Indian History Congress. It was held in Bhopal. And it was 2001. And with the prize money, I bought one book that was Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, published by Permanent Black by Tanika Sarkar. And when I actually started leafing through the pages, I said, oh my God, everything that actually now I am wrestling with, the basic arguments has already been written by Professor Sarkar. And I think within a couple of months or a year, I once again encountered Professor Uma Chakrabarty's Pandita Ramabai, where I think Professor Uma Chakrabarty has also written about Rukmabai and the interplay of caste, community, and nation, and how everything actually boiled down to reformulate another image, another discourse on widowhood. So in this book, I have tried to map the entire, the social reform, the entire history of women's question in social reform. And I just could
Professor Chakrabarty, can you hear us? Professor Chakrabarty, can you hear us now? Your video was frozen previously.
I think the line got disconnected. Shall I stop here now today? And shall I take a few more questions?
Yeah, I think this would be a good stopping point because we're running out of time. But this truly was a very engaging, very enriching discussion. And I'm sorry that this needs to end at this point, but we are running out of time. So I request Dr. Chatterjee now to give the vote of thanks so we can wrap up today's wonderful program.
Thank you, Jyotika. Before that, I think we should ask the audience once, though there are no questions in the chat box. If there is anyone who wants to ask any questions, one or two questions can be taken up. I don't think we are getting any questions right now. Okay, so let me go ahead with having to put an end to such a beautiful evening. From Primus Books, I would first like to thank the audience who have listened to an evening of wonderful discussion and for, sort of, I hope, enjoying the discussion. We hope you like reading the book as much after these observations by our eminent panelists. This is the appropriate stage and occasion to thank Mr. Shugat Jain, the managing director of Primus and Ratnasagar Books, who follows and supports his father, Dr. Dhanesh Jain's vision, and whose constant support and encouragement, even during these trying times of the pandemic, has helped us keep publishing quality research and bringing them to the readers. While we gradually emerge from the shadows of these times, this support and commitment towards academic publishing will be remembered. I would like to thank our eminent panelists, Professor Tanika Sarkar, Professor Rochona Majumdar, Professor Swapna Banerjee and Professor Brian Hatcher for launching this book and for their extremely relevant observations about the work. We express our gratitude to them for taking out some of their valuable time to be here today and for presenting us with their views about widows in colonial Bengal. We would like to thank Professor Aishika Chakrabarty for believing in Primus books and giving us the opportunity to publish this wonderful work of research. Our thanks are due to all the prominent contributors. We are grateful to Mr. B.N. Verma, head and founder of Primus Books, for commissioning this book. We end the evening today with our remembrance of the late Dr. Dhanesh Jain, who nurtured Primus Books from its beginning during his lifetime and left us with a legacy to cherish academic books and their publication. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prashun. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Hatcher and
Great to see everyone.
Professor Banerjee.
Good to see you
Professor
too.
Majumdar.
Please be in touch, everyone. Take care.
Certainly. Looking forward to your next book.
I hope it comes out in one piece. We'll see. No, I'm just kidding. It'll be fine. Thank you all. Aishika, congratulations again.
Aishika, congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you for taking it.
Bye.